We tend to view archaeology as a story of discovery, a neat progression where each excavation adds another piece to an ever-expanding puzzle. But this conception is fundamentally misleading. The reality is that most evidence has vanished entirely. Monuments have eroded into rubble. Many written records have been lost or survive only in fragments. Entire populations have left behind so little that we struggle to prove they ever existed at all. Sometimes all that remains is a single object, a carved surface, or perhaps just a rumor passed down through oral tradition until it blends into legend. And in the spaces between these rare survivors, uncertainty reigns. It's within that uncertainty where mysteries take root and flourish. Before we dive in, what mystery from history has always fascinated you the most? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to see which one you'd explore first, and if you love exploring the unexplained, go ahead and subscribe. There's so much more ahead. What lay recorded on the countless stone tablets buried beneath South American deserts? How did ancient peoples engineer structures with precision that still puzzles researchers about the methods used? What knowledge was encoded into monuments that stretch across entire landscapes, visible only from heights we couldn't reach until aircraft were invented? And it goes beyond just missing information. Sometimes whole periods vanish from the historical record, decades or centuries where contemporary observers left almost nothing behind. Other times, thriving societies disappeared so thoroughly that we cannot even identify them by name. Only by fragments of pottery or foundations beneath overgrown terrain. These are not minor details or academic footnotes. They represent essential chapters of human achievement that have been erased by time, conflict, and circumstance. What we're about to explore isn't a straightforward recounting of historical events or a linear progression of dates and facts. Instead, imagine this as an expedition through ruins, where we examine tangible evidence and attempt to reconstruct meaning from what little remains. Some mysteries are contained within a single artifact. Others encompass entire civilizations and the questions they raise about human capability and ambition. Take a moment to get settled wherever you find yourself. Whether you watch along or simply listen as background accompaniment, this material is designed to work either way. The visuals are here for context if you want them, but they're not necessary. You can just listen, follow along, and let the stories unfold. With that said, we begin not with the grand temples or sprawling cities that dominate history books, but rather with thousands of mysterious stone vessels scattered across remote tropical terrain in Southeast Asia. Some jars reach around 2 to 3 meters in height. They are monumental stone vessels that can tower above a person, yet nobody alive understands what purpose they served. Were they burial chambers, ritual vessels, agricultural storage, something more esoteric that our vocabulary lacks words to describe? The mystery awaits. Somewhere in the misty highlands of Laos, far from major cities and largely forgotten by the modern world, there exists a landscape unlike anywhere else on Earth. We're talking about thousands of massive stone jars scattered across rolling terrain, some as tall as a man, some weighing several tons each. These aren't small pottery vessels you'd find in a museum case. These are monumental. These are undeniable. And yet, no one truly knows why they're there. The Plain of Jars, as it's called today, sits in Sieng Khoang province in northeastern Laos. The site itself is enormous, spread across multiple locations, with some clusters containing over 100 jars densely packed together. The scale is difficult to grasp until you're actually there, walking among them, running your hand along their weathered surfaces, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down. Some jars stand in neat rows, others are scattered haphazardly as if dropped from the sky. A few are cracked, broken into sections that lay like fallen monuments to forgotten purposes. The jars themselves are carved from a hard stone, likely limestone or sandstone, and they vary considerably in size and shape. The smallest might reach only waist height, while the largest tower above your head, their openings wide enough to fit a person inside. The walls are thick, substantial, made to last. And they have lasted. Archaeological studies suggest these jars were created somewhere between 500 BC and 500 AD, placing them deep in prehistory, thousands of years before European explorers would stumble upon them and leave written records. Think about that timeline. These objects were already ancient when Rome was at its height. The leading theory among archaeologists is that the jars served a funerary purpose. In many Southeast Asian cultures, exposure burial was practiced, where the dead were placed in elevated containers to allow decomposition and the eventual dispersal of remains. The plain of jars, in this interpretation, becomes a vast necropolis, a city of the dead where an entire civilization honored their ancestors through monumental stone vessels. Supporting this theory are finds of cremated bones and burial goods inside some of the jars, evidence that suggests ritual treatment of the dead. But here's where it gets complicated. The distribution of the jars doesn't follow typical burial patterns. If these were all funerary vessels for a single community or even a connected network of communities, we'd expect to find more cultural consistency, more evidence of the people who buried their dead here. Yet the archaeological record remains sparse. No large settlements have been found nearby, no temples or ceremonial structures that would typically accompany such important ritual sites. It's as if the jars exist in isolation, monuments built for a specific purpose and then abandoned to time. Other theories suggest these vessels served entirely different functions. Some researchers proposed they were used for storage, perhaps collecting water in a region where moisture was precious. Others suggest they were for fermentation, used in ancient brewing or food preservation practices that left little archaeological trace. Still others wonder if they had a ceremonial purpose beyond death, perhaps used in rituals or spiritual practices we can no longer fathom because the culture that created them has vanished from history. What makes the mystery deeper is the construction itself. These jars were carved from stone that had to be quarried, shaped, and transported across terrain that would have been difficult. No finished jars have been found at potential quarry sites, so either the quarries are undiscovered or the carving was done after transport, which raises its own questions about logistics and labor. How many people would it take to move a multitian stone jar across Laotian highlands? How were they shaped so uniformly without standardized tools? The precision of the work suggests a culture with advanced knowledge of stoneworking, yet we find no other evidence of such sophistication in the archaeological record from that region and time period. During the Vietnam War, this region became part of the secret bombing campaign, the most heavily bombed country per capita in human history. Cluster munitions fell like rain, and many of the jars were damaged or destroyed. Some were even used as bunkers by soldiers seeking shelter. The landscape itself became scarred, pockmarked with bomb craters that still remain. This tragedy added another layer to the mystery because it destroyed evidence. How many clues were lost to warfare? How many jars were obliterated, along with any inscriptions or markings that might have revealed their purpose? The mysterious deepens when you consider the people involved. Archaeological teams have tried to trace the origins of the jar culture to known civilizations in the region, but the connections remain tenuous. The Dai people, the Lao, early Khmer, each theory has supporters and skeptics. The truth is, we don't have enough evidence to draw clear lines between the mysterious jar builders and any documented historical group. It's possible the culture that created these monuments left almost no other trace, or their story was absorbed into later civilizations and forgotten. Recent archaeological work using more sophisticated dating techniques has provided some answers but raised more questions. Ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation have revealed more about the jars themselves, but the broader context remains murky. We know more about how they were made, but we know no more about why. We understand their physical properties, but their purpose slips away like sand through fingers each time we think we've grasped it. So here's the central enigma. Somewhere between 500 and 2,000 years ago, a culture with impressive engineering capabilities and organized labor managed to carve and erect thousands of massive stone jars across an entire landscape. They did this for a reason, meaningful enough to invest enormous resources and effort. They accomplished something remarkable. And then they vanished from history so completely that we cannot even say with certainty who they were. What was the purpose that drove them? And where did they go? If you were standing among those silent stone jars right now, what do you think they were really used for? Leave your theory in the comments. Beneath the scorching sands of Egypt, hidden in the shadow of more famous temples, lies something that shouldn't exist. We're talking about the Osirion at Abydos, a structure so anomalous that it has sparked decades of debate among Egyptologists and engineers. Most of the temple sits above ground, its walls decorated with hieroglyphics and its layout following the familiar patterns of New Kingdom temple architecture. But beneath it, descending down into darkness, lies a chamber that defies conventional understanding of ancient Egyptian capability. The Osirion chamber consists of a central hall surrounded by massive granite blocks, some of the largest stones ever quarried and moved in the ancient world. The Osirion contains very large granite blocks, substantial, heavy stones, often described as tens of tons, fitted with unusually fine precision. Some historians suggest even more. These aren't small stones, these are enormous rectangular sections of granite, precisely squared and fitted together with such precision that you cannot slide a papyrus sheet between them. The workmanship is extraordinary, almost machine-like in its exactitude. What makes the Osirion truly mysterious is the contrast with the temple above it. The upper temple, built by Seti I and his son Ramesses II, displays all the hallmarks of New Kingdom construction. Limestone walls, hieroglyphic inscriptions, artistic decorations in the recognizable style of the 19th dynasty. The construction method is evident in the tool marks, the rough draft outlines, even the unfinished sections that show how the work was intended to proceed. It's a complete record of deliberate, human labor with technology appropriate to the period. The Osirion's underground construction shows very fine stone fitting and an appearance of precision that has attracted comment. However, Egyptologists document ancient Egyptian craft techniques that can account for much of this workmanship. The walls form perfectly straight lines. The floor is level with extraordinary precision. It's as if the underground chamber was built using techniques entirely different from the temple above. This discrepancy has led some researchers to propose a radical suggestion. The Osirion is older than the temple built around it. Perhaps much older. Perhaps so old that its builders are completely unknown to us. Perhaps it predates the New Kingdom by centuries or even millennia. The theory goes that Seti I, when constructing his temple complex at Abydos, discovered this mysterious underground structure and built his temple around it, incorporating it into the religious significance of his monument without fully understanding what he was working with. The problem with this theory, from a conventional archaeological perspective, is that there's no evidence the Osirion ever functioned independently. No separate entrance has been found, no independent dating of the structure's construction has been possible. The design, while unusual, isn't impossible for ancient Egyptian builders to have achieved if they devoted sufficient resources and possessed the necessary motivation. And motivation they certainly had. Abydos was one of Egypt's most sacred sites, associated with the god Osiris and the afterlife itself. If any project would inspire builders to push beyond normal limits, it would be one with such religious significance. Yet the engineers and Egyptologists who have studied the structure in detail often express a certain unease. The precision of the stonework exceeds what we find in most Egyptian temples from the same period. The stone type, red granite from Aswan, was difficult to work. The quarrying alone would have required enormous resources. The transportation, moving those massive blocks down the Nile and then overland to Abydos, would have been a logistical nightmare. The fitting and assembly, ensuring each block joined perfectly to its neighbors, would have demanded skill and patience of the highest order. The question that keeps recurring is this: why? Why build underground? Why use such massive blocks when smaller, more manageable stones would have served? Why invest such resources in a substructure no one would ever see? The underground chamber has no clear ceremonial function. It's not decorated. It contains no hieroglyphics explaining its purpose. It's simply a room, vast and precisely built, but to what end? Some Egyptologists suggest it was built as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb for Osiris, or perhaps for Seti himself. a mystical burial place that connected the pharaoh to the afterlife and to Osiris in a profoundly spiritual way. Others propose it was a warehouse or ritual chamber, though for what specific purpose remains unclear. Still others wonder if the Osirians served a function we simply cannot understand because we lack the cultural context of ancient Egyptian religion and spirituality. The most controversial theory, one that most mainstream Egyptologists firmly reject, proposes that the Osirian represents architectural knowledge beyond what ancient Egyptians possessed, and that it may have been built by an earlier, unknown civilization. The adherents of this view point to the Osirian as evidence of a lost prehistoric advanced culture that preceded known Egyptian civilization. They suggest that later Egyptians either inherited knowledge from these predecessors or discovered their works and attempted to preserve them. This theory has no mainstream scientific support, and for good reasons. The dating evidence, while not perfectly precise, suggests the Osirian was built within the known historical context. The tool marks and construction techniques, when examined carefully, do show signs of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship. The project's scope, while ambitious, isn't beyond what we know Egyptian society was capable of achieving when sufficiently motivated. And yet, the nagging mystery remains. Why build something so precisely, so monumentally, in a place no one would ever see? What knowledge, what vision, what spiritual understanding drove such dedication to perfection? The Osirian stands as a testament to ancient capability, to the mysteries of lost motivation, and to our own limited understanding of what our ancestors could achieve when purpose burned bright enough to justify any effort. In Scotland, on a hillside not far from Glasgow, lies a stone slab that has puzzled researchers for nearly 2 centuries. We're talking about the Cochno Stone, a massive block of bedrock carved with intricate patterns that seem to tell a story only the ancient carvers understood. The stone itself is enormous, measuring roughly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, and its entire surface is covered in deliberate carvings of astonishing complexity and precision. The patterns consist primarily of cup and ring markings, circular impressions with concentric rings radiating outward. In some cases, the rings are connected by lines, creating additional shapes and patterns. The cups themselves vary in depth and size, from shallow impressions that catch the light to deeper holes that might have held some symbolic or practical purpose. The rings surrounding them number from 1 to as many as 7, creating a visual rhythm across the stone's surface. Between the cup and ring patterns are other symbols, some geometric, some seemingly representational, including what appear to be footprints, handprints, and possibly animal forms. Carvings are often assigned to the Neolithic Bronze Age. Estimates vary, but many place them in the Bronze Age, several thousand years ago. That places it in a period when Scotland was home to early farming communities with sophisticated spiritual beliefs and artistic traditions. Yet what those traditions meant remains obscure. Cup and ring stones are found throughout Scotland, northern England, and even parts of continental Europe, suggesting a shared cultural tradition across a wide geographic area. This distribution implies that the practice of carving these patterns held meaning significant enough to justify the enormous labor involved, and that this meaning was understood and valued across multiple communities separated by considerable distances. Yet what that meaning was remains completely opaque to modern interpreters. One theory suggests the patterns represent astronomical markers. Some researchers have proposed that the arrangements of cups and rings correspond to star maps or celestial events. The idea is that ancient peoples possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge and encoded information about the heavens into stone. If this were true, the Cochno Stone would be a record of ancient science, a textbook written in stone for those with the knowledge to read it. However, attempts to correlate the patterns with known constellations or celestial phenomena have produced contradictory and unconvincing results. For every researcher who finds a celestial match, another finds the correlations to be coincidental or forced. Another interpretation suggests the cups and rings represent a symbolic or spiritual system, perhaps encoding spiritual truths or serving as a meditation focus for ritual purposes. The stone might have been a place of pilgrimage or spiritual significance, its carvings serving as a visual language for religious concepts that was central to the culture that created it. This theory is attractive because it acknowledges the labor investment without requiring us to understand the specific meaning, but it also doesn't really explain anything beyond the obvious observation that the patterns were deliberately created. More recently, some researchers have proposed that the carvings represent a territorial marker or genealogical record, encoding information about family connections, land ownership, or tribal identity. The different cups and rings might represent different family groups or individuals, with their arrangement telling a story about relationships and social structure. This would explain why similar patterns appear across a wide geographic area and why the effort to create them would be considered worthwhile. If the stone recorded important social information, its creation and maintenance would be valued by the community. The most intriguing aspect of the Cochno Stone is that it disappeared for more than a century. It was recorded and studied in the 1880s, but then the stone fell into disrepair and became overgrown with vegetation. Its location was lost, its significance faded, and it became almost a legend among archaeologists, a mysterious artifact that might exist but couldn't be verified. In 2014, using historical records and local knowledge, researchers rediscovered it, buried under layers of soil and moss. When they carefully cleaned it, the patterns emerged once again, and the mystery was renewed. The cleaning process itself raised questions about preservation. As the moss and lichen that had accumulated over centuries were removed, they took with them their own record of time. And yet, without cleaning, the patterns remain obscured and their study impossible. This tension between preservation and investigation highlights one of archaeology's central dilemmas. How do we study something without changing it? Since the rediscovery, the Cochno Stone has become a focus of renewed research. Teams have used advanced imaging techniques to document every detail of the carvings, creating digital models that might reveal patterns invisible to the naked eye. They've compared it systematically with other cup and ring stones, looking for consistencies that might suggest a shared symbolic language. And yet, the stone's meaning remains elusive. Every interpretation requires assumptions that can't be tested. Every theory leaves unexplained elements, and every expert eventually admits the same thing. We simply don't know what these carvings meant to the people who created them. The Cochno Stone stands as a reminder that the most striking human creations sometimes resist our attempts at understanding. We can measure them, analyze them, compare them, and yet they remain fundamentally mysterious. Messages from the past addressed to an audience that no longer exists. Imagine walking across the Breton countryside in northwestern France and seeing a landscape transformed into something otherworldly. Before you stretches not one or two standing stones, but thousands of them, arranged in straight lines that extend for miles across the rolling terrain. We're talking about the Carnac Stones, one of Europe's most impressive, yet least understood, megalithic sites. Carnac comprises over 3,000 megaliths. The largest menhirs reach several meters in height, around 3 to 4 meters. They stand in alignment so precise that they seem to defy the technology available to people 6,000 years ago. The stones vary in size from massive menhirs that took enormous effort to transport and erect, to smaller standing stones that seem almost delicate by comparison. But what makes Carnac truly remarkable is the pattern. The stones aren't scattered randomly or arranged in a loose collection. They form multiple distinct alignments, creating bands of stone that run parallel to each other across the landscape, like petrified rivers flowing across the earth. Some alignments contain dozens of stones, others hundreds. Some alignments extend over a kilometer or more, several kilometers in total across the site. The Mainnek and Camario alignments are long linear arrangements stretching well over a kilometer. The stones themselves appear to have been chosen for their distinctive shape and size, with larger stones typically placed at the beginning of each alignment and smaller stones toward the end. This graduated arrangement suggests intentional planning and organization. The stones were brought from multiple quarry sites, some from considerable distances, and positioned with obvious care and deliberation. The effort involved must have been staggering, requiring community organization on a scale that implies a sophisticated society with centralized authority and the ability to mobilize significant labor. Dating the Carnac stones has proven challenging, as with most megalithic sites. However, archaeological investigations suggest they were erected sometime during the Neolithic period between 5,000 and 6,000 years ago, and some may be even older. This places them in the same era as other European megalithic sites like Stonehenge or the Passage Tombs of Ireland, yet Carnac seems to follow a completely different tradition and purpose. Unlike Stonehenge, which appears to have served astronomical or ceremonial functions centered on a specific location, Carnac creates an entirely different kind of landscape, one dominated by linear arrangement and vast scale. The primary mystery at Carnac isn't whether the stones were deliberately placed, because that's obvious. The mystery is why. What purpose could justify the enormous effort required to quarry, transport, and position thousands of stones across the landscape? The leading theory proposes that the alignments served as processional routes, with communities gathering regularly to walk among the stones in ritual or ceremonial processions. The stones would have created a sacred landscape, transforming the natural terrain into a spiritual geography that channeled movement and focused attention. If this theory is correct, the alignments represent something like an ancient roadway, but one designed for sacred pilgrimage rather than practical transportation. Evidence supporting this interpretation includes the discovery of cairns or stone burial mounds associated with some of the alignments and the existence of what appear to be gathering places at certain junctions or endpoints of the alignments. The stones themselves sometimes show signs of wear that might suggest they were touched or even climbed by countless pilgrims over centuries. If ancient peoples did indeed walk among these stones, the erosion of contact points would be expected, and such wear has been claimed to exist on certain stones. Another theory suggests the alignments served astronomical or calendrical purposes. The idea is that certain alignments mark significant celestial events, such as the solstices or equinoxes, and that the stones served as a vast calendar carved into the landscape. Observers standing at specific points along the alignments could watch the sun or stars rise or set over particular stones, creating a natural clock that tracked the passage of seasons. This would have been enormously valuable to agricultural societies dependent on knowing the proper times for planting and harvesting. However, testing this theory has proven difficult. While some alignments do appear to correspond roughly with astronomical orientations, the correspondences aren't precise enough to suggest intentional design. Skeptics argue that given 3,000 stones, some alignments will inevitably match celestial phenomena purely by chance. Without clear evidence that specific stones were chosen for astronomical alignment, the theory remains speculative. A third interpretation proposes that Carnac represented a territorial marker, with the alignments demarcating boundaries between different tribal or community territories. The stones would have declared ownership of the land and perhaps served as gathering places for councils or dispute resolution. Multiple communities contributing to the construction of a shared system of alignments would have created a landscape of negotiated boundaries, sacred to all the groups that participated in its creation. The mystery deepens when you consider the uniformity of the sites across Europe. Alignments similar to those at Carnac exist elsewhere in Brittany and in other parts of Western Europe. Some researchers propose that these represent evidence of a widespread Neolithic culture with shared beliefs and practices, a pan-European phenomenon that connected distant communities through common spiritual or practical needs. Others suggest the similarities reflect independent discoveries of the same solution to the same problem, the way different cultures might independently discover agriculture or similar technologies. What remains undeniable is that Carnac represents an enormous investment of community resources into landscape modification and monumentality. For 6,000 years, these stones have stood on the Breton hillside, their original purpose lost, but their physical presence undeniable. They required planning, cooperation, and a shared vision of what the landscape could become. They represent an expression of something deeply important to the people who built them, whether that was spirituality, astronomy, territorial identity, or something else entirely. The Carnac stones endure as monuments to human ambition and human mystery. We can walk among them, measure them, study them, and still fail to understand what they meant to those who stood among them millennia ago. In the high-altitude deserts of southwestern Bolivia, on a plateau where the air is thin and the landscape seems almost unearthly in its desolation, there exists an archaeological mystery as vast and enigmatic as the sky above it. We're talking about the Sajama Lines. Researchers describe the Sajama Lines as an extensive network of thousands, possibly tens of thousands, of lines covering vast areas of the Altiplano. Some work suggests their cumulative extent is very large, and their aerial coverage may exceed the Nazca Lines, though they are different in form and context. The Sajama Lines are on the high Andean Altiplano, high elevation, around 3,500 to 4,500 meter. The landscape here is harsh, with minimal vegetation and extreme temperature variations between day and night. The lines themselves are created by the removal of the dark desert varnish that covers rocks and soil across the Altiplano, revealing the lighter colored earth or stone beneath. Some lines are hundreds of feet long, others stretch for miles. They converge, intersect, and branch off in patterns that suggest purposeful design rather than random chance. The sheer number of lines is staggering. Researchers have documented thousands of individual lines across multiple survey areas, and estimates suggest the total number might reach tens of thousands. When viewed from an aircraft, the landscape appears to be covered with an intricate web of geometric patterns, a vast textile woven into the earth itself. What makes this even more remarkable is that creating these lines, especially on a landscape of this scale and at this elevation, would have required enormous effort. Each line would have to be walked or marked repeatedly to maintain its visibility, or created using techniques that would involve deliberately removing the desert varnish across significant distances. The dating of the Sajama lines is uncertain, as is the dating of the Nazca lines to which they are often compared. There are no organic materials associated with the lines that can be radiocarbon dated, and no clear cultural context that definitively connects them to specific historical periods. However, based on comparison with other archaeological sites in the region and on the cultural patterns of South American civilizations, researchers believe the lines were created sometime between 800 and 2,000 years ago, during periods when complex societies were flourishing in the Andes region. Theories about the purpose of the Sajama lines are as numerous as the lines themselves. The most prominent theory draws parallels to the Nazca lines and proposes that the lines served astronomical or calendrical functions. In this interpretation, the lines marked important celestial events or celestial bodies, creating a vast astronomical calendar that tracked the passage of seasons and the movements of stars. For agricultural societies dependent on precise timing for planting and harvesting, such a calendar would have been invaluable, and the investment in creating it would have been justified. However, efforts to correlate the Sajama lines with specific astronomical phenomena have produced mixed results at best. Some researchers have identified correlations between certain lines and solstices or equinoxes, but the correlations are often approximate rather than precise, and skeptics argue that given the number of lines, correlations are inevitable by chance. Without clear evidence that specific lines were intentionally designed to mark specific celestial events, the astronomical theory remains unproven. Another theory proposes that the lines served as ritual pathways or processional routes, similar to what some researchers propose for other megalithic and geoglyphic sites. In this interpretation, communities gathered regularly to walk along the lines in ceremonies or rituals that affirmed social bonds and spiritual connections. The lines themselves would have transformed the landscape into a sacred geometry, marking out paths that connected different communities or different ceremonial locations. Yet another interpretation focuses on the possibility that the lines connected water sources, particularly important in a landscape where water is scarce and access to reliable sources of moisture could determine survival. Some researchers have proposed that lines aligned with springs, seasonal streams, or other sources of water, and that the lines served as indicators of these vital resources. In this view, the lines represent not artistic or astronomical ambition, but practical problem solving, a way of marking and remembering the location of life-sustaining resources. More recent theories proposed that the lines might have served as territorial markers or boundary indicators, demarcating the territories of different communities or ethnic groups. The high-altitude plateau of Bolivia has long been home to diverse populations with distinct identities and territories. If the lines were created during periods when these communities were establishing or maintaining territorial boundaries, the vast scale of the lines would make sense as a way of making these boundaries visible and permanent across the vast landscape. The biggest mystery surrounding the Sajama lines, however, is why they have received so little attention compared to the Nazca lines. The Nazca lines became famous after their aerial visibility was documented in the 20th century, but the Sajama lines, despite being equally impressive and perhaps even more extensive, have remained relatively obscure. This difference in recognition partly reflects the accessibility of the sites and partly reflects historical accident and the impact of popular media attention. What's more, very little systematic archaeological research has been conducted on the Sajama lines. The harsh environment, the high elevation, and the remote location make fieldwork difficult and expensive. There are no museums dedicated to the Sajama lines, no organized tourist visits, no popular documentaries. The lines sit on the Altiplano, invisible to anyone who doesn't know to look for them, their meaning lost to time and their existence forgotten by all but a handful of researchers. This presents a unique mystery, not just the question of what the lines meant to those who created them, but the question of why we have chosen to ignore them. Somewhere in the high deserts of Bolivia, thousands of miles of precisely arranged lines cover the landscape, created by human hands and human intention, yet we have failed to study them, to understand them, or even to properly acknowledge their existence. What do the Sajama lines represent about human effort and human ambition? And why have they been left to fade into obscurity while their distant cousins in Peru capture the world's imagination? Do you think we overlook certain mysteries simply because they don't fit our existing explanations? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're still watching, that means you're one of us. So tap that subscribe button and join our mystery community. Near the shores of Lake Titicaca, one of the world's highest navigable lakes and a site of profound spiritual significance in Andean cultures, there was discovered an artifact that should not exist. We're talking about the Fuente Magna Bowl. The Fuente Magna is a bowl reportedly found near Lake Titicaca, bearing markings some have compared to Sumerian cuneiform. Its provenance and the authenticity interpretation of the inscriptions remain highly disputed. Mainstream scholarship treats the claim of ancient Sumerian contact with substantial skepticism. The bowl itself is unremarkable in its physical form. It's made of ceramic, decorated with geometric patterns typical of pre-Columbian South American art, approximately 8 inches in diameter, but the inscriptions are what make it extraordinary and controversial. Around the bowl's rim and across its surface are markings that resemble Sumerian cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system that Sumerians used to record information on clay tablets in Mesopotamia between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. Wedge-shaped impressions are clearly visible on the bowl's surface, and some researchers have identified specific Sumerian signs among them. When the bowl was first examined by scholars, there was considerable excitement. If authentic, and if the inscriptions were genuinely Sumerian, the bowl would provide evidence of contact between ancient Mesopotamian civilization and pre-Columbian American cultures, something that would revolutionize our understanding of ancient history. The implications would be staggering. How did Sumerians, living in what is now Iraq and lacking evidence of advanced ocean navigation, manage to reach South America? Or did the bowl travel by a different route, perhaps overland through a series of contacts, or carried by some ancient maritime civilization we know nothing about? However, mainstream archaeology has been decidedly skeptical about the Fuente Magna Bowl. The consensus view is that the bowl is either a hoax created in modern times using impressed cuneiform signs, or that the inscriptions are coincidental markings that bear superficial resemblance to Sumerian without being actual Sumerian text. The reasoning is straightforward. There is no archaeological evidence of contact between ancient Mesopotamia and pre-Columbian America. The technology for transoceanic voyages was not available in the ancient world, and all attempts to find supporting evidence of such contact have failed. Advocates for the bowl's authenticity counter that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. They point out that much of the evidence for ancient maritime contact could have been lost over millennia. Boats decay, leaving no trace. Communities can rise and fall without leaving extensive archaeological records. Knowledge can be lost and forgotten. Just because we haven't found supporting evidence doesn't mean it doesn't exist, or that it couldn't have existed in the past. Furthermore, they argue that dismissing the bowl without thorough investigation represents close-mindedness that contradicts the scientific method. The problem is that scholarly analysis of the bowl has been limited. While some researchers have examined the inscriptions and compared them to documented Sumerian signs, not all experts agree on what the markings represent. Some identify multiple Sumerian glyphs, others see only vague similarities, and still others argue that the markings are too unclear or ambiguous to represent genuine text. The disagreement reflects the fundamental problem. Without a clear understanding of what the bowl says, it's impossible to determine whether it represents actual ancient contact or mere coincidence. To complicate matters further, the bowl's provenance, the record of its ownership and location over time, is unclear. How was it acquired? Who owned it previously? How was it found? Answers to these questions would help establish whether it's genuine or a fabrication. However, the documentation is sparse and uncertain. This lack of clear provenance doesn't prove the bowl is a hoax, but it does mean that authentication is difficult. In archaeology, provenance is crucial because it can determine whether an artifact is a genuine historical object or a modern creation designed to deceive. Some researchers have proposed that the bowl represents a contact event we have no other evidence for, possibly involving ancient Phoenician or Egyptian seafarers known for their maritime capabilities. Others suggest it might represent knowledge of ancient texts that made its way to South America through mechanisms we don't understand. Still others propose entirely speculative scenarios involving lost advanced civilizations or unexplained transoceanic contact. The most skeptical interpretation is that the bowl is a 20th century creation, possibly created by someone with knowledge of Sumerian who wanted to create a hoax. The level of sophistication required to create such a deception is not particularly high, especially given how easily modern people can research and copy ancient writing systems. The bowl could have been created using simple tools and then aged to appear ancient, or purchased as an authentic piece and later inscribed. The lack of clear provenance actually makes this scenario more plausible. What makes the Fuente Magna Bowl so mysterious is precisely that we cannot definitively resolve the question. Every piece of evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways. The inscriptions might be Sumerian or might be coincidental. The bowl might be ancient or modern. The contact it suggests might have happened or never occurred. Science requires evidence that can be tested and verified, and the Fuente Magna Bowl resists such verification. It sits in the space between possibility and probability, between what could have happened and what evidence suggests actually did happen. The bowl represents a larger question about the limits of our historical knowledge. Ancient texts were destroyed, boats decayed, cultures vanished without trace. We know only a fraction of what happened in the ancient world. The possibility of ancient transoceanic contact exists, even if mainstream scholarship finds it unlikely. The Fuente Magna Bowl might represent genuine contact between distant civilizations, or it might represent our willingness to see connections where none exist. The mystery remains unsolved. High on sandstone cliffs in the Darkinjung mountain region of New South Wales, Australia, there exist carvings that shouldn't be there. We're talking about the Gosford Glyphs, geometric patterns and symbols carved into the rock face that bear a striking resemblance to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. The carvings include representations that some researchers have identified as Egyptian gods, cartouches, and other symbols consistent with Egyptian religious iconography. Their existence in remote Australia raises questions about ancient contact and about what we think we know of human migration and trade in antiquity. The glyphs themselves are quite clear and deliberate. The carvings are deep enough to be distinctive and were created using tools capable of cutting through sandstone. Among the symbols identified by supporters of the Egyptian connection are what appear to be representations of Khnum, the ram-headed god of the Nile, and Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom. There are also symbols that some researchers interpret as cartouches, the oval frames that contain the names of Egyptian pharaohs. The arrangement of the glyphs suggests a deliberate message or record, not random markings. The problem is obvious. Egypt and Australia are separated by thousands of miles, vast oceans, and entirely different historical trajectories. Ancient Egyptians, while accomplished seafarers in some respects, showed no evidence of possessing the maritime technology or knowledge needed to reach Australia. The voyage would have been extraordinarily difficult and dangerous, requiring navigation skills and shipbuilding capabilities that are not attested in the archaeological record. Yet here, on an Australian cliff face, are symbols that appear unmistakably Egyptian. Most Egyptologists and archaeologists treat the Gosford Glyphs as a modern hoax or recent carving, rather than genuine ancient Egyptian inscriptions. The theory goes that sometime in the 20th century, someone with knowledge of Egyptian hieroglyphics created these carvings as an elaborate prank or deception. The motivation might have been to create a mystery for others to puzzle over, or to suggest ancient contact as a way of testing public credulity. The perpetrator supposedly visited the remote cliff face, created the carvings using modern tools, and then left them to be discovered and debated by future researchers. Support for the hoax theory comes from several observations. First, the style of the carvings is inconsistent with genuine Egyptian art. While individual symbols might resemble Egyptian hieroglyphics, the overall composition doesn't follow Egyptian conventions for organizing and arranging hieroglyphic text. Real Egyptian inscriptions follow specific grammatical and organizational rules that these glyphs don't seem to follow. Second, the location on a remote Australian cliff face is exactly where you'd expect a hoaxer to place the glyphs if they wanted to create maximum mystery and difficulty for eventual investigators. Third, no one has ever produced credible evidence of ancient Egyptian presence in Australia or in the Pacific region more broadly. However, defenders of the glyphs' authenticity argue that dismissing them as a hoax requires its own assumptions that may not be justified. They point out that many aspects of ancient Egyptian seafaring capability remain poorly understood. They note that Egyptian maritime trade networks were more extensive than popularly realized, reaching as far as the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. They suggest that an expedition to Australia, while difficult, is not theoretically impossible if ancient peoples possessed knowledge and motivation we no longer understand. Furthermore, advocates for authenticity question why anyone would go to such elaborate trouble to create a hoax on a remote cliff face that few people would ever see. The effort required to reach the location, to create detailed carvings that would last for decades or centuries, and to do all this in a way that wouldn't be immediately discovered as fraudulent seems disproportionate to the potential reward. A modern hoaxer would have easier ways to achieve the same effect. Why undertake such labor unless the glyphs represented something genuine? Another theory proposes that the glyphs represent not direct Egyptian contact, but rather knowledge of Egyptian symbolism and hieroglyphics that arrived in Australia through more indirect routes. Perhaps ancient travelers from the Middle East visited Australia and shared knowledge of Egyptian symbols with Aboriginal peoples. Or perhaps, in a more speculative scenario, Aboriginal peoples developed their own symbol systems that coincidentally resembled Egyptian hieroglyphics, creating the appearance of contact where none actually occurred. The most intriguing question, however, is whether the glyphs can even be definitively dated. Unlike organic materials that can be carbon dated, Sandstone carvings are notoriously difficult to age precisely. Erosion patterns, weathering, and lichen growth can all provide clues, but these indicators are not precise enough to definitively establish whether carvings are ancient or modern. The style and technique of the carving might offer hints, but distinguishing between ancient and modern stonework on sandstone is not a science, but an educated guess. Recent investigations using modern archaeological techniques have added layers of complexity rather than clarity. Some researchers have claimed that the weathering patterns on the glyphs are consistent with considerable age, suggesting they could be centuries or even millennia old. Others have argued that the weathering patterns are actually consistent with relatively recent carvings that have simply been exposed to Australian weather for a few decades. The evidence remains ambiguous and subject to interpretation. What makes the Gosford Glyphs truly mysterious is that they sit at the intersection of possibility and evidence between what could theoretically have happened and what the available evidence suggests actually occurred. An ancient Egyptian expedition to Australia is extraordinarily unlikely based on everything we know about ancient seafaring and Egyptian civilization. Yet the existence of these glyphs on an Australian cliff face cannot be easily explained away. Either they are a hoax of remarkable elaborateness, or they represent a historical event so unusual that we have no framework to understand it. The glyphs remain in place, weathering slowly, continuing to perplex those who encounter them and sparking debate about what they represent. By now, you've seen patterns of incredible craftsmanship across continents. But which one so far feels most mysterious to you? Tell me below before we continue. Near Lake Taupo in the central North Island of New Zealand, hikers following mountain trails occasionally encounter something unexpected. Scattered across rugged terrain, sometimes in remote locations far from populated areas, are sections of carefully constructed stone walls. The stones are precisely fitted together without mortar, the craftsmanship evident in every joint. These are the Kaimanawa Walls, and their existence raises profound questions about New Zealand's prehistory and about what civilizations might have inhabited these islands before the arrival of the Polynesian peoples who became the Maori. The walls are quite distinctive. Unlike the rough, practical walls built for farming or property boundaries, the Kaimanawa Walls show evidence of sophisticated stonework and considerable effort in their construction. The stones are selected and shaped to fit together precisely. The walls follow linear patterns and demonstrate evidence of advanced planning and organization. Some sections are meters in length, creating barriers that would have required significant labor to construct. The quality of the stonework suggests not a single construction event, but an ongoing tradition of wall building, with maintenance and expansion over time. The mystery begins with the question of origin. Who built these walls? New Zealand was settled by Polynesian voyagers sometime between 800 and 1,000 years ago, becoming the Maori people who developed their own distinct culture. Before the arrival of these Polynesian settlers, New Zealand was uninhabited by humans. This is the mainstream historical understanding, backed by archaeological evidence that shows no signs of human habitation prior to Polynesian settlement. Yet the Kaimanawa Walls exist, and their craftsmanship suggests they were built by people with considerable skill and organizational capability. One possibility is that the Kaimanawa Walls were built by the Maori themselves, representing early Maori construction practices before European contact. The theory goes that as Maori communities expanded across the islands and developed territorial boundaries, they built these walls as markers of their territories or as part of agricultural and defensive systems. The precise stonework would represent the sophistication of early Maori engineering and architectural knowledge. This theory has significant support within New Zealand archaeology. Most mainstream scholars argue that the Kaimanawa Walls are almost certainly of Maori origin, dating to somewhere within the last 1,000 years of New Zealand's human history. The stonework techniques used are consistent with what we know of Maori construction practices. The locations of the walls, often positioned for territorial advantage or to control movement through landscape, follow patterns consistent with Maori settlement strategies. The evidence, while not definitive, supports Maori authorship. However, alternative theories have been proposed that suggest more ancient or exotic origins for the walls. Some researchers have suggested that the walls might predate Polynesian settlement, representing evidence of earlier human habitation in New Zealand. In this scenario, people of unknown origin would have reached New Zealand before the Polynesians, established themselves, built walls and other structures, and then vanished or were displaced by later arrivals. The theory essentially proposes that New Zealand's human history extends further back into the past than archaeological evidence currently suggests. These alternative theories draw parallels to other disputed archaeological sites around the world, particularly in the Pacific region. They suggest that ancient seafaring capabilities of pre-Polynesian peoples may have been more extensive than mainstream scholarship acknowledges. They point to the enigma of how Polynesians successfully navigated vast distances across the open Pacific Ocean, suggesting that if they could accomplish such voyages, other ancient peoples might have done so as well. The problem with these alternative theories is that they lack supporting evidence. No artifacts of clear pre-Polynesian origin have been found in New Zealand. No cultural remains, burial sites, or settlement structures clearly predate the Polynesian arrival. The archaeological record is remarkably consistent in showing no signs of human habitation before roughly 800 years ago. This consistency across numerous archaeological sites and surveys makes the hypothesis of pre-Polynesian settlement difficult to justify. Yet the Kaimanawa Walls themselves represent a genuine anomaly in the archaeological record. While most scholars identify them as Maori, the precise dating of the walls has proven difficult. The techniques used to construct them could have been employed at any point within the last 1,000 years or even further back. Without clear datable materials associated with the walls, establishing their age precisely remains impossible. This uncertainty creates space for alternative interpretations. Another mystery associated with the Kaimanawa Walls is their purpose. If they were indeed built by Maori communities, what specific function did they serve? Some researchers suggest they were defensive structures, parts of fortified settlements. Others propose they were boundary markers or territorial declarations. Still others suggest they served agricultural functions, channeling water or directing animals. The walls themselves don't provide clear answers to these questions. Without written records from pre-contact Maori societies that might explain the wall's purpose, we can only speculate based on their position and structure. The issue of natural versus artificial formation adds yet another layer of mystery. Some skeptics have questioned whether the Kaimanawa Walls are actually human-made constructions at all. Could they represent natural formations that merely appear to be deliberately built? Could they be sections of larger natural rock formations that have been mistaken for constructed walls? The counter-argument is that careful examination of the walls shows evidence of artificial shaping and fitting that cannot be explained by natural processes. The precision of the joints and the deliberate selection of stones clearly indicate human intervention. What makes the Kaimanawa Walls truly intriguing is that they challenge our assumptions about New Zealand's past. The Maori culture, which flourished in New Zealand from the time of Polynesian settlement onward, developed sophisticated technologies and architectural practices. The building of walls was part of this cultural tradition. Yet we know relatively little about early Maori history or the development of these practices over time. The Kaimanawa Walls might represent a crucial piece of evidence about early Maori culture and territorial organization, yet their significance remains poorly understood. The walls endure on the New Zealand landscape, weathering slowly, continuing to puzzle those who encounter them, and continuing to spark debate about what they represent in the broader story of New Zealand's human past. In the jungles of Costa Rica, scattered across riverbeds, clearings, and abandoned settlements, are objects that seem to defy the technological capabilities attributed to pre-Columbian American cultures. The Diquís, Costa Rica spheres range from centimeters to over 2 mm in diameter and can weigh up to approximately 15 tons. They are notable for their spherical shapes and polished surfaces. While impressive, mainstream archaeology attributes them to skilled pre-Columbian artisans not to impossible technologies. The spheres are known from multiple locations across the Diquís Delta region in southwestern Costa Rica, though their precise distribution and number remain unclear. Some were documented and studied during the 20th century, but many have been lost to development, looting, or relocation. Early European explorers and settlers noted the spheres' presence, and accounts of them persist in historical records. However, systematic archaeological study of the spheres has been limited, and fundamental questions about their origins and purposes remain unanswered. The craftsmanship evident in these spheres is extraordinary. When you stand before one of the larger specimens, what strikes you immediately is the uniformity of its shape. The spheres are not merely round in a general sense, they are precisely spherical, with the radius measuring virtually identical from any direction. The surface is smooth, polished, showing no facets or irregular sections. If you were to roll one of these spheres across a level surface, it would move in a straight line without wobbling, indicating that the distribution of mass is remarkably uniform. Achieving such precision with stoneworking tools available in pre-Columbian times would have been extraordinarily difficult. The stones themselves are granite or gabbro, extremely hard rocks that require considerable expertise to work. Quarrying and shaping such massive blocks would require specialized knowledge and sophisticated tools. The labor investment involved in creating a single large sphere would have been enormous. How many workers would be required? How many months or years of effort? How many tools would wear out in the process? The answer to these questions suggests a culture with significant resources, established labor systems, and specialized knowledge that would have been passed down through generations of stoneworkers. Most were produced in the pre-Columbian period. Estimates vary, commonly cited ca. 500 to 1500 CE, and they are generally attributed to the region's indigenous cultures, Diquís and Chiriquí. However, more precise dating has remained elusive. Some researchers have suggested that the spheres were created as recently as 300 years before European contact. Others proposed dates extending back 1,000 years or more. The most widely accepted theory among mainstream archaeologists is that the Diquís Spheres were created by pre-Columbian cultures of the region, likely the Chiriquí or related groups. In this interpretation, the spheres served some ritual or symbolic purpose, perhaps as markers of territory or status. They might have represented deities or embodied spiritual power. They could have been created to commemorate important events or individuals. The fact that we don't fully understand their purpose doesn't negate their cultural significance or diminish the sophistication of the cultures that created them. Others suggest they might indicate the existence of advanced pre-Columbian cultures whose sophistication has not been fully appreciated or understood by modern archaeology. The most extreme alternative theory proposes that the Diquís Spheres represent evidence of an advanced civilization that predated known pre-Columbian cultures. According to this view, an unknown culture with technological capabilities comparable to modern civilization created these spheres and then vanished from history, leaving behind only these mysterious objects. The theory lacks supporting evidence but persists, partly because the spheres seem so incompatible with what we believe about pre-Columbian technology. More moderate alternative theories suggest that the spheres might represent the work of a specialized class of artisans who developed techniques for achieving the precise spherical shape. These craftspeople might have used sophisticated methods that have since been forgotten, techniques that were passed down through generations but eventually lost to history. The spheres themselves might represent the culmination of a long tradition of stoneworking, the result of hundreds or thousands of years of refinement and innovation. What's particularly intriguing is that the Diquís Spheres are not unique in their precision. Other pre-Columbian cultures achieved remarkable levels of craftsmanship with stone. The Inca stonework, for example, demonstrates construction techniques that even today inspire admiration and speculation. The precision of Mayan architecture and engineering is extraordinary. The sophisticated astronomy encoded into Aztec monuments reveals sophisticated mathematical and observational knowledge. The Diquís Spheres fit into this broader pattern of advanced pre-Columbian achievement, yet they remain in some sense more mysterious than other accomplishments because their precise purpose is less clear. The mystery of the Diquís Spheres is not primarily about whether they could have been created by pre-Columbian cultures, because clearly they were. The mystery is more subtle. Why were they created at all? What motivated the investment of enormous labor into crafting perfectly spherical stones when that labor could have been applied to food production, defensive structures, temples, or other practical purposes? What did these objects mean to the culture that created them? And how did such a specific skill develop and persist? Some of the spheres have been moved from their original locations and placed in museums or public spaces. Others remain in the jungles of Costa Rica, slowly being covered by vegetation or damaged by weather and human interference. Some have been excavated and removed, their original context destroyed in the process. This gradual loss of context and relocation of the spheres themselves makes systematic study increasingly difficult. Each moved sphere represents lost information about its original purpose and meaning. What the Diquís Spheres ultimately represent is the limits of our understanding. They are undeniably human creations, products of intentional labor and sophisticated craftsmanship. They represent achievement, investment, and meaning. Yet what that meaning was, why they were created, and how they fit into the broader history of pre-Columbian Costa Rica remains largely mysterious. They stand as reminders that even when we possess physical evidence of past human accomplishment, understanding the deeper significance of that accomplishment often remains beyond our grasp. What unites all these mysteries is not so much that they are unsolved, but that they remind us of how little we truly know about human history. We tend to think of the past as settled territory, charted and mapped by archaeologists and historians. We picture timelines with dates and dynasties, neat progressions from primitive to advanced, but the reality is far more complex and far more mysterious. Entire civilizations have left barely a trace. Technologies and knowledge have been lost and forgotten. Monuments were created for purposes we can no longer understand. Human accomplishment often exceeds what we thought possible, yet the reasons behind that accomplishment escape us. History is a puzzle. Some pieces are perfectly clear, others are faded and half-remembered, and countless others are simply missing. That's the real fascination. Not just the facts we have, but the uncountable possibilities still hidden in the ruins, archives, and unexplored landscapes. Now it's your turn. What missing history captivates you the most? Drop your theories in the comments below. I'll be replying to my favorites. Don't forget to check out our channel for more deep dives into our lost past. Until next time, stay curious.